August sun carved the Dakota Territory like a blacksmith's blade, through copper splitting earth into fissures that breathed heat like dragon mouths. Clara Martinez Barnes pressed against cottonwood bark that crumbled at her touch, dying wood mirroring dying hope. Her heart hammered Morse code against ribs that still ached from Jed's fists, while 3-month-old Thomas wheezed in her trembling arms, his tiny body a furnace of fever that had nothing to do with the merciless sky above. Blood from her split lip had crystallized into dark flakes. She licked them away, tasting copper and desperation. Her calico dress, once decorated with cheerful flowers that reminded her of Pennsylvania meadows, now hung in tatters, a patchwork quilt of sweat dust and substances she refused to name. Behind them, perhaps 5 miles toward Deadwood Creek, gunshots cracked the afternoon stillness. 3 reports. Deliberate. Jed had discovered their flight. His voice rode the scorching wind. Find that ungrateful whore. I don't care if you bring her back breathing. Clara's right boot had disintegrated during their escape, leaving her foot raw and bleeding with each step. Thomas's cries had weakened from healthy wails to whispered whimpers that broke something fundamental inside her chest. She'd soaked torn petticoat in precious water from their single mason jar. But the makeshift compress did nothing against the fever consuming her son. The endless prairie stretched before them like a broken promise. Buffalo grass and sage bending before winds that carried no mercy, only the constant reminder of their isolation. Somewhere beyond, in the shimmering horizon, 40 miles northeast through terrain that grew more dangerous with each step, lay Fort Davidson. If she could reach the army post, if she could tell them what Jed had done. Another gunshot echoed closer. Then the deep baying of bloodhounds, 6 distinct voices rising like a funeral choir. Clara's legs trembled, muscles cramping from dehydration, and the constant strain of carrying Thomas across landscape designed to kill the weak. But she forced herself onward, clutching her son like a talisman, whispering half-remembered prayers from childhood, when God had felt closer than he did in this God-forsaken wilderness. The memory struck without warning, triggered by the scent of sage crushed underfoot. Jed's work-hardened fist connecting with her jaw 6 days after their wedding. You don't question your husband, woman. Out here a man's word is absolute law. The flash dissolved as quickly as it came, leaving Clara gasping. She'd arrived in Deadwood Creek 26 months earlier, stepping off the dusty stagecoach with high hopes and carefully counted savings. The advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer had seemed like divine intervention after her parents' deaths left her drowning in debt. Respected cattleman seeks God-fearing woman for marriage. Good home security and bright future provided. The accompanying photograph showed what appeared to be a gentleman with kind eyes as different from reality as paradise from hell. Jedediah Barnes had courted her with prairie flowers and gentle words, speaking eloquently about Christian homes and his love for children. The truth revealed itself only after wedding vows were spoken. The sound of distant hoofbeats triggered another fragment. Her stomach, 6 months pregnant, striking the kitchen table edge. Dinner's late. He'd snarled, whiskey thick on his breath. You trying to poison me with your incompetence? Clara stumbled, the memory more real than the ground beneath her feet. Dr. Elias Morrison had noticed the patterns, broken ribs disguised as accidents, cuts, explained away as Eastern clumsiness with frontier life. His weathered hands had trembled when examining her wounds, guilt written across his lined face. But in Dakota Territory, marital affairs stayed private, regardless of visible evidence, suggesting those sacred bonds had become chains of torment. Billy Morrison, the doctor's son, possessed younger blood that demanded action against injustice. He'd witnessed Clara's condition firsthand, seen the fear flickering in her eyes whenever Jed's footsteps approached. Unlike his father, bound by professional ethics, Billy burned with righteous anger and determination to see justice done. Whispers had circulated through town for months, fragments of conversations that ceased when Clara approached. Sarah Whitman discovered dead in Miller's Creek, after rejecting Jed's marriage proposal too publicly. Official records listed accidental drowning, though everyone knew Sarah could navigate those waters blindfolded. Mary Hoskins, the schoolteacher, who vanished during a winter blizzard after threatening to report cattle count irregularities. Her body was never found. Most disturbing were the small personal items that appeared in Jed's possession: a hair ribbon matching one Mary had worn, a distinctive button from Sarah's dress, trophies serving as private reminders of his power over life and death. Now Clara struggled through grass that cut like tiny knives, each blade drawing blood from her exposed legs. Thomas had thrived during his first months, bringing joy even amid her private hell. But that happiness ended 5 days ago when Jed's fury escalated beyond calculated restraint. The argument had begun over money. Clara's discovery of evidence proving Jed systematically embezzled cattle profits and pocketed territorial tax revenues. Her confrontation, motivated by naive hope that appealing to his conscience might reform his behavior, proved catastrophic. Mother and infant had sprawled across their cabin's rough plank floor. Thomas struck his tiny head against the iron table leg, and by evening, severe illness gripped his small body with frightening speed. The baby's temperature climbed relentlessly through the night, despite Clara's desperate cooling attempts. By dawn, convulsions racked his frame, and breathing became labored. When Clara begged Jed to fetch Dr. Morrison, he backhanded her savagely. "Boys got summer fever, nothing more. Babies get sick all the time. Most survive if they're tough enough. If he dies, we'll make another." But Clara recognized symptoms from her Philadelphia childhood, helping her mother tend the sick and dying in tenements, where poverty and disease claimed children with heartbreaking regularity. The gray pallor spreading across Thomas's features, the increasingly labored breathing signs demanding immediate medical intervention. Recognition crystallized her desperate decision to flee, fueled by maternal instinct stronger than fear, and growing certainty that Jed would let Thomas die rather than risk awkward questions. Better to perish free in the wilderness than watch her son slowly expire under indifferent neglect. She'd waited until Jed departed for his weekly poker game, then moved swiftly despite cracked ribs that made every breath painful and a wrenched shoulder limiting her range of motion. The water-filled mason jar represented their most precious resource. Several pieces of hardtack went into her bundle, along with Thomas's spare blanket and meager savings sewn into her coat's lining coins that might purchase help if they encountered honest travelers. The terrain showed no mercy. Prickly pear cactus snagged her torn skirts with needle-sharp spines, drawing blood through thin fabric. Heat waves distorted air, even as sun began its grudging descent, creating mirages mocking their thirst with false promises. Her water supply diminished with alarming speed, shared between desperate thirst and Thomas's greater need. Every sip represented calculated risk: conserve water, and watch her son die of dehydration, or share freely, and face the possibility both would perish when supplies ran dry. A diamondback's warning rattle froze her mid-step during the first day. The serpent coiled near shade she'd hoped to use for rest, thick as her wrist and longer than her arm, triangular head, weaving while tracking her movements with unblinking eyes. Clara detoured widely, stumbling through thorny undergrowth that tore additional holes in her dress and left bloody scratches, attracting flies. The encounter reminded her how completely unprepared she was for this hostile environment, where death lurked behind every rock, where weakness meant death and strength offered no guarantees. As the first day ended with no sign of pursuit, Clara had covered perhaps 15 miles across landscape, seemingly designed to destroy body and spirit. Her feet bled freely inside, destroyed boots, leather split by sharp stones, staining stockings dark red and leaving tracks any competent tracker could follow. Exhaustion made her stumble with increasing frequency, weakened body struggling under the dual burden of carrying Thomas and maintaining pace necessary to stay ahead of inevitable pursuit. She discovered minimal shelter behind red sandstone rocks that continued radiating heat hours after sunset surfaces too hot for direct contact, even in evening's relative cool. The rocks provided concealment, but no comfort, forcing a sleepless night, listening for approaching danger, while Thomas's condition deteriorated. The baby's condition worsened dramatically as darkness fell like a suffocating blanket. His tiny body convulsed with chills, despite lingering heat breathing coming in rapid, shallow gasps that terrified his mother more than all Jed's threats combined. Clara attempted repeatedly to give Thomas water, but he couldn't retain it, expelling whatever small amounts she coaxed down his throat within minutes. Precious liquid was wasted soaking into dry earth instead of providing desperately needed hydration. She dozed fitfully when exhaustion overcame fear, startling awake at every sound. Coyotes yipped in the distance, calls answered by pack members from various directions as they coordinated evening hunts. The wild chorus reminded Clara they weren't alone. Predators moved through darkness, following scent trails and stalking the vulnerable with patient hunger. Something large crashed through nearby grass during darkest hours before dawn. Likely a deer seeking water, or perhaps something more dangerous, drawn by the scent of blood from Clara's wounds. In her exhausted, frightened state, every shadow concealed mortal danger, every sound carried the promise of discovery. When dawn broke like a wound across eastern sky, painting the world in blood and gold, Clara forced her battered body upright and resumed her northward journey. The morning sun climbed with merciless efficiency, transforming landscape into a furnace that sapped strength and will, and by 10 o'clock heat had become nearly unbearable. The second day brought new challenges. Relatively flat grassland gave way to broken country carved by ancient streams and seasonal floods, a maze of gullies, ridges, and hidden obstacles that slowed progress and consumed precious energy. Deep arroyos cut across her intended path, forcing lengthy detours that cost valuable time and exposed her to observation from greater distances. Some dry creek beds held pools of stagnant water that might be safe to drink, or might contain bacteria and parasites that would kill within hours. The choice between certain thirst and possible poisoning became a recurring nightmare with Clara, forced to make life or death decisions based on incomplete information and growing desperation. Beside one questionable water source, she encountered other dangers. A small buffalo herd, perhaps 20 animals representing remnants of vast herds that once darkened the plains, came to drink at the muddy pool she'd been approaching with desperate hope. These weren't massive herds that had sustained plains tribes for generations, but even this modest group represented tons of muscle and horn that could trample her and Thomas without noticing. Clara crouched in tall grass, barely daring to breathe as huge animals drank and wallowed with prehistoric dignity. Thomas chose that moment to cry a thin wail that seemed impossibly loud, cutting through afternoon stillness like a knife and drawing attention from every creature within miles. Several buffalo raised massive heads, ears twitching as they tried to locate the unfamiliar sound. For endless moments, feeling like hours, Clara was certain they would charge, driven by instincts that made them dangerous to experienced hunters, armed with rifles and mounted on fast horses. The image of being crushed beneath their hooves while Thomas died in her arms filled her mind with paralyzing terror. But gradually, the herd lost interest, returning to drinking and wallowing, as if the crying infant were merely another voice in the prairie symphony. They moved on, eventually leaving Clara shaking with relief and newly aware of how unprepared she was for survival in this hostile environment where every encounter carried potential for disaster. By the second day's end, pursuit had closed significantly. Professional trackers in Jed's employ read her trail with skill born of years hunting both animals and humans across unforgiving terrain. Clara could hear dogs more clearly now, individual voices distinct as they worked her scent with methodical patience of predators who knew their quarry was weakening. Worse than dogs were occasional glimpses of dust clouds on the southern horizon, marking progress of mounted men who knew this country far better than she ever could. These riders possessed every advantage: superior numbers, better equipment, detailed terrain knowledge, and ruthless determination that came from serving a man who paid well for results and asked no questions about methods. The landscape continued changing as Clara traveled north, endless grassland giving way to varied terrain that offered both opportunities and dangers. Rolling hills provided concealment from distant observation, but required exhausting climbs that sapped remaining strength. Rocky outcroppings offered shade and shelter, but might also conceal enemies or predators waiting in ambush. That afternoon brought a new challenge. Storm clouds began building on the western horizon, at first appearing to offer blessed relief from relentless heat and the promise of fresh water to replenish dwindling supplies. But as clouds grew darker and more ominous, Clara realized this wasn't going to be the gentle shower she'd prayed for throughout long, hot hours of travel. Wind picked up dramatically as the storm approached, bending grass nearly flat, and filling air with dust that stung her eyes and throat, making it difficult to breathe or see more than a few yards. Temperature dropped suddenly, but instead of providing relief, the change brought its own dangers as Clara's sweat-soaked clothing made her vulnerable to hypothermia if the storm proved severe. When the storm hit with nature's full fury, it came not as rain, but as a dust storm that turned day to night and filled air with choking grit that penetrated every fold of clothing and scrap of shelter. Clara wrapped Thomas as tightly as she could in his blanket, pressing herself against the lee side of a large boulder, while wind scoured the landscape with sandpaper intensity that stripped paint from rocks and flesh from exposed skin. The storm lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. A concentrated dose of nature's power that left Clara coughing and nearly blind when it finally passed. Her mouth was filled with grit, precious water supply contaminated with dust that made it barely drinkable, and her already limited visibility reduced further by irritated eyes that streamed tears in futile attempts to clear accumulated debris. But the storm provided one crucial advantage it would make, tracking far more difficult for pursuing dogs and riders, buying precious time before the hunt could resume in earnest. Wind would have scattered her scent trail and filled tracks with blowing sand, forcing trackers to work much harder to maintain contact with their quarry. By the third day, Thomas's condition had become truly critical. The fever burning through his tiny body showed no signs of breaking despite Clara's desperate attempts to cool him with dampened cloths and small amounts of contaminated water she could spare from their dwindling supply. The baby had stopped nursing entirely, his small mouth too dry and system too disrupted by illness to accept nourishment his body desperately needed. Clara knew with growing despair that she was watching her son die by degrees, powerless to help, despite her willingness to sacrifice everything for his welfare. The knowledge ate at her soul like acid, filling her with guilt and helplessness, almost more unbearable than physical pain of her injuries and exhaustion. Every labored breath Thomas drew might be his last, and there was nothing she could do except hold him close and whisper prayers that seemed to disappear into the vast indifference of the prairie sky. In this state of near-complete hopelessness, with her son dying in her arms and pursuit closing from behind, Clara spotted smoke rising from behind a low ridge ahead. The thin column of gray against blue sky made her heart hammer with mixture of hope and terror, as she considered possibilities it represented. Fire could belong to travelers, perhaps friendly ones, willing to help a desperate mother and sick child. It could mark an army patrol conducting routine reconnaissance. Or it could signal Jed's men who had somehow gotten ahead during the dust storm and were waiting in ambush. Clara faced the most difficult decision of her life, weighing certainty of Thomas's death against unknown dangers represented by that distant smoke. Her son was dying regardless of what choice she made, but fire offered the only possibility of help within reach. The decision was made when Thomas went completely limp in her arms, breathing so shallow she had to watch his chest carefully to detect any movement, skin taking on grayish pallor that spoke of a system shutting down as death approached. With no other options and nothing left to lose, Clara turned toward the smoke, knowing it might mean death, but unable to accept defeat while any chance remained for saving her child. Better to die trying than watch Thomas expire without making every possible effort, even if that effort proved futile. The smoke originated from a small fire, built beneath a natural rock overhang where centuries of wind and rain had carved a shallow cave from red sandstone dominating this part of the territory. As Clara approached on unsteady legs, each step requiring conscious effort to maintain balance, she could see a single figure seated beside carefully maintained flames, working with strips of meat hung on wooden racks to dry in heat and smoke. The man was unmistakably Indian Lakota. She realized with mixture of fear and desperate hope, recognizing distinctive beadwork on his clothing, and the way his long black hair was braided with leather strips and decorated with eagle feathers that caught afternoon light. Her steps faltered as she remembered terrifying stories circulated around Deadwood Creek about savage Indians who killed white settlers without mercy, scalping women and children before disappearing back into wilderness like demons returning to hell. But Thomas was dying in her arms. Maternal desperation overcame racial prejudice, born of ignorance, and carefully cultivated fear. If this man meant to kill them, at least their suffering would end quickly and mercifully. If he might help or even show indifference rather than hostility. It represented their only chance for survival in a situation that had become hopeless through conventional means. The warrior appeared to be in his early 30s, with weathered copper skin that spoke of a lifetime spent under the prairie sun, and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing as they assessed her condition with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. When he saw her stumbling approach, he made no move toward the military-issue rifle that lay across his knees, nor did he reach for the knife and tomahawk hanging from his belt with easy accessibility of frequently used tools. Instead, displaying compassion that seemed to transcend racial hatred poisoning relations between their peoples, he reached for a decorated leather water pouch beside the fire and held it out without speaking, his expression grave but not hostile. The gesture spoke of basic humanity that recognized suffering regardless of skin color or cultural background. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice cracking like old leather after days of limited water and constant exposure to dust and wind. "Not for me. For him." She nodded toward Thomas, whose skin felt hot enough to start fires and whose breathing had become so labored that each breath seemed to require tremendous effort from his tiny body. The man, she would later learn his name, was Chaska, meaning firstborn son. In the Lakota language, set aside his weapon with deliberate care and gestured for her to sit beside the fire, where heat would provide some comfort despite the day's warmth. When she collapsed gratefully onto the ground legs, finally giving out after carrying her and Thomas across mile after mile of hostile terrain, he knelt beside her to examine the baby with gentle hands that spoke of experience caring for children. His weathered fingers checked Thomas's temperature by touch, calloused skin surprisingly gentle against the infant's fevered flesh, then listened to his labored breathing by holding his ear close to the tiny chest. He felt for swollen glands in the baby's neck with delicacy of someone who understood how fragile life could be. And when he looked up at Clara, his expression was grave with concern that seemed genuine, despite the fact they were strangers from different worlds. "Very sick," he said in careful English that carried a heavy accent but demonstrated familiarity with her language, suggesting previous contact with white traders, missionaries, or military personnel. "Baby need medicine water. Cool water healing plants from sacred places." He pointed north in the direction where Fort Davidson lay, hidden beyond the horizon, then shook his head slowly with obvious regret. "Too far. Little one maybe not live to see blue soldiers." Clara felt her world crumble as reality struck with devastating force. They were still days away from any medical help, and Thomas was dying now, his tiny body unable to fight the fever much longer. "There has to be something," she pleaded, tears streaming down her dust-streaked cheeks. "Please, he's all I have left in this world. I'll do anything and give you anything you want." Chaska studied her face intently seeing raw desperation and fierce maternal love that had driven her to attempt this seemingly impossible journey across hostile territory with nothing but determination and hope to sustain her. Something in her expression touched a deep wound in his own heart, reminding him of losses that still ached like fresh injuries, despite passage of time that was supposed to heal all wounds, but sometimes only made them deeper. The sight of this white woman holding her dying child with such tender desperation brought back memories of another woman, another child, both lost forever, through circumstances beyond anyone's control, but the cruel indifference of fate and hatred that seemed to poison relations between their peoples. For a moment, the present faded away, and he saw again the face of his beloved Winona holding their son Dakota, both victims of violence that had shattered his world and sent him into exile from everything he had once held dear. "I help," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm with resolve that surprised even himself. The decision came from some deep place in his soul that still believed in the possibility of redemption, still hoped that by saving one child, he might somehow balance the scales for all the children he had failed to protect in the past. But dangerous path ahead. Much danger waiting for all of us. Husband, he comes soon with many men. Yes, with dogs that never tire, guns that kill from far away. Clara nodded, tears falling freely now as she realized anyone was willing to help them in their desperate situation. "He'll kill us all if he catches us," she confirmed, her voice breaking with strain of holding back sobs that would accomplish nothing except waste precious energy. "He's murdered other women who crossed him before. I know what he's capable of doing, and he'll show no mercy to anyone who helps me." Chaska's expression darkened at this confirmation of what he had already suspected from her condition and circumstances of their meeting. He had encountered enough evil in his life to recognize its signs and bruises on her face, told a story that transcended cultural boundaries. Violence against women and children was despicable regardless of the race or tribe of those who committed such acts. The warrior began breaking camp with efficient movements that spoke of long practice, avoiding pursuit, hands working automatically while his mind calculated distances, timing, and resources they would need for what promised to be a running battle across territory that offered few advantages to the hunted. Strips of meat went into a leather bag, along with other supplies that might mean the difference between life and death in days ahead. "Then we go now," he said, shouldering his rifle and checking loads in his revolver, with methodical care of a man who had learned that survival often depended on having weapons ready when needed. Find safe place before they catch scent again. Maybe reach sacred caves in broken country where spirits protect those who seek shelter from evil. As they prepared to abandon temporary shelter that had offered Clara her first moment of hope. In days she caught glimpses of Chaska's story through his few possessions and the practiced way he moved through routines that spoke of a life lived on edges of civilization. His rifle was military issue, suggesting contact with soldiers either through trade or conflict. Scars on his hands and arms told of violent survived battles fought and wounds that had healed but left permanent reminders of mortality. Most telling were small personal items he packed with obvious care. A child's moccasin decorated with tiny beads, a woman's hair ornament crafted from silver and turquoise things that spoke of profound loss and love that transcended death itself. These were not possessions of a savage, but treasured mementos of a man who had once known happiness and family, who carried memory of better days like sacred relics connecting him to a world that no longer existed. They traveled through heat of the afternoon, Chaska leading them along paths invisible to Clara's untrained eyes, but clear as highways to his experienced gaze. He moved like a ghost across landscape, reading signs in bent grass and disturbed stones that warned of danger ahead or promised safety for those wise enough to interpret nature's subtle messages. Every few hundred yards, he would pause listening and watching for signs of pursuit, his entire body tense with alertness of a hunted animal. Thomas's fever broke slightly during their journey, helped by small doses of water mixed with herbs from Chaska's medicine bag roots and leaves he had gathered from sacred places where his people had collected healing plants for countless generations. The baby even managed to nurse a little when they stopped for brief rest, giving Clara the first genuine hope she had felt in days that her son might survive this ordeal. But Chaska remained troubled, constantly checking their back trail and listening for sounds that Clara's ears couldn't detect, but that spoke to him of approaching danger. His face was grim with knowledge that they were being hunted by men who possessed every advantage except intimate knowledge of this particular territory. And even that advantage might not be enough against superior numbers and equipment. "And dogs still coming," he said during a brief rest in whatever shade they could find, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might alert their pursuers to their location. "Maybe 4 or 5 hours behind now. Need find better place to hide place where horses cannot follow and men must come one at a time." That evening, as sun began its descent toward western horizon, and shadows grew longer across broken landscape, and they took shelter in a narrow canyon where flash floods had carved deep channels in red sandstone over countless centuries. Walls rose high above them, offering concealment from distant observation, but also creating danger of being trapped if their pursuers discovered the entrance and blocked escape routes. Chaska seemed familiar with this place, leading them without hesitation to a hidden pool where clear water bubbled up from underground springs that had never known contamination from human activity. The sight of clean, fresh water was like a miracle to Clara, who had been rationing their contaminated supply with increasing desperation as Thomas's needs grew more critical. "My people used this place for many generations," Chaska explained as they refilled their water containers with liquid that tasted sweeter than wine to Clara's parched throat. "Sacred place, where spirits dwell in the water and rocks. Maybe spirits protect us here from those who hunt with evil in their hearts." Clara wanted to ask about his people, about why he was alone in this wilderness instead of with his tribe. But exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. She slept fitfully beside the spring, while Chaska kept watch rifle across his knees and eyes constantly scanning the canyon rim for signs of danger. Several times during the night, she woke to check on Thomas, finding the baby's breathing easier and fever continuing to recede thanks to clean water and whatever healing properties were contained in Chaska's herbal remedies. Dawn brought the sound they had been dreading, dogs barking in the distance, still faint, but growing steadily closer as the pack worked their scent trail with inexorable patience of death itself. Chaska was already awake, rifle cleaned, and ready, extra ammunition arranged within easy reach where it could be accessed quickly during the battle that now seemed inevitable. "They find canyon soon," he said grimly, his voice carrying weight of a man who had faced such situations before and understood the limited options available to the hunted when confronted by superior numbers. "Must decide now, run deeper into maze where we might get lost forever, or choose ground for fighting where we have small chance of victory." Clara looked at Thomas, who was nursing weakly, but steadily for the first time since their flight began. His fever finally broken and color returning to something approaching normal. The sight of her son recovering from illness that had nearly claimed his life filled her with desperate determination to protect him at any cost, even if it meant facing impossible odds against ruthless men who would show no mercy to women or children. "We can't keep running forever," she said, surprised by steel in her own voice. "And I won't let them take him back to that monster. If we're going to fight, let's choose the place and make them pay dearly for whatever they think they're going to accomplish." The canyon offered natural advantages that might offset their disadvantages in numbers and firepower, narrow approaches that would force attackers to come single-file high walls that provided cover from distant rifle fire and multiple escape routes for those who knew the terrain well enough to navigate the maze of passages connecting this location to others throughout the broken country. But they were still essentially two adults and a baby, against what sounded like a large, well-armed group of professional manhunters who were accustomed to tracking down fugitives and bringing them back dead or alive according to their employer's preferences. The odds were heavily stacked against them, and everyone involved understood that this confrontation would likely end in death for at least some of the participants. The waiting proved to be the hardest part of their ordeal, knowing that discovery was inevitable, but not knowing when or how it would come. They could hear the pursuit getting closer throughout the morning, the baying of hounds working a scent trail, occasional shouts as riders coordinated their search patterns, and the echo of hoofbeats on stone as the hunters drew nearer to their quarry with each passing hour. Billy Morrison found them first following dogs who had locked onto their trail despite all attempts at concealment and evasion. The young man appeared at the canyon entrance like a ghost rifle held ready, but not immediately aimed at them, his face a mask of conflicted emotions as he took in the scene before him. When he saw Clara's battered condition clearly for the first time, the faded bruises, the cuts that were still healing, the way she instinctively flinched at his sudden appearance, his expression shifted from professional determination to growing horror. This wasn't the dangerous fugitive he had been told to expect, but a victim of systematic abuse who had risked everything to protect her child from further harm. "Jesus, Mrs. Barnes," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the canyon's acoustic chamber. "He really did beat you that badly. This isn't what I signed up for when I agreed to help track you down." Clara recognized him through the haze of fear and exhaustion that had clouded her thoughts. Dr. Morrison's son, the young man who had sometimes assisted his father during medical calls throughout the territory. Recognition brought a flicker of hope that perhaps not everyone in Jed's employ was completely without conscience or compassion for the innocent. "Billy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing with them? I thought you were different from the others, that you might understand what's really happening here. I signed on to help track you down." He admitted, but his voice carried no conviction, and his rifle remained pointed at the ground rather than at her or Chaska. "My pa told me what he saw at your place during his visits. The bruises you tried to hide, the fear in your eyes whenever footsteps approached the house, the way you flinched at sudden sounds even when you were supposed to be safe. He's been eating himself up with guilt for not speaking out when he had the chance." The young man's face worked with internal struggle as he weighed his official duties against his conscience, duty against human decency, the easy path against the right path. "I can't fight the whole bunch of them by myself," he continued, glancing back toward the canyon entrance where other voices were growing closer. "But maybe I can even the odds. Some give you a chance to get away, or at least make them pay a price for whatever they think they're going to accomplish here." Before Clara could respond to this unexpected offer of assistance, shouts echoed from the canyon mouth as other members of the pursuit force discovered the entrance and began making their way into the narrow passage. Jed Barnes himself was leading them forward, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space as he issued orders to his men with confident authority of someone accustomed to having commands obeyed without question. Billy quickly melted back into the rocks, positioning himself where he could observe the approaching confrontation while remaining hidden from his former allies, but not before giving Clara a meaningful look that might have been reassurance, a silent promise that she and Thomas would not face the coming battle entirely alone. Jed Barnes emerged from the canyon entrance like a specter of Clara's nightmares, made flesh, his familiar silhouette filling her with terror that went beyond rational fear into primal recognition of her tormentor. He was flanked by 5 hard-faced men she didn't recognize, hired guns with the cold eyes and casual violence of professional killers who viewed human life as a commodity to be traded for the right price. Behind them came the dogs, 6 bloodhounds straining against their leashes with eager anticipation of violence, their baying echoing off canyon walls like the howls of demons released from hell. The sound made Thomas cry weakly in Clara's arms, and she instinctively pressed him closer to her chest, shielding his small body with her own, as if love alone could protect him from what was coming. Well, well. Jed called out his voice, carrying the mock jovial tone she remembered from their early courtship days, before the mask had fallen away to reveal the monster beneath. Look what we have here. My dear wife consorting with savages and teaching our son to do the same. Clara, darling, you've led us quite a chase across this God-forsaken wilderness. He stepped forward with the confident swagger of a man who believed himself to be in complete control of the situation, his hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered revolver. I hope you've enjoyed your little adventure because it ends here and now. You're coming home with me, and we're going to have a long, private conversation about wifely obedience and the consequences of defying your husband's authority. Clara found her voice despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her completely. I'm not going anywhere with you, Jed. Not after what you've done to me, and not after what you almost did to Thomas. I'd rather die in this canyon than spend another day under your roof. Jed's expression darkened at her open defiance, and the facade of civilized behavior cracking to reveal the rage that always simmered just beneath the surface. You don't have a choice in the matter, you ungrateful whore. You belong to me just like that baby belongs to me, and I'll be damned if I let some red-skinned savage convince you otherwise. His gaze shifted to Chaska, who had remained motionless beside the spring rifle held ready, but not yet aimed at any specific target. And you heathen bastard, have made the last mistake of your miserable life. Did you really think you could steal a white man's wife and child and get away with it? I'm going to enjoy watching you die slowly for your presumption. Chaska rose to his feet with fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in dangerous situations, his movements economical and purposeful, as he positioned himself between Clara and the armed men. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady, carrying no trace of fear despite the overwhelming odds they faced. I steal nothing, he said simply, his accented English clear and precise. Woman come to sacred place seeking help for dying child. I give help because spirits command compassion for those who suffer, regardless of skin color or tribe. You are the one who brings violence to sacred ground, white man. You are the one who will answer to spirits for your actions. One of Jed's hired guns, a scarred man with the pale eyes of a born killer, spat contemptuously and raised his rifle. I've heard enough of this redskin philosophy. Let me put a bullet in his brain and be done with it. But before he could take aim, Billy Morrison's voice rang out from concealment among the rocks above them, his words carrying the authority of someone who had made a final, irrevocable decision. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Garrett. Not unless you want to explain to the territorial authorities why you murdered an unarmed Indian in cold blood. Jed spun around, his face contorting with rage as he spotted Billy's position among the canyon walls. Morrison, what the hell do you think you're doing? Get down here and help us collect my property before I lose what little patience I have left. I don't think so, Mr. Barnes. Billy replied, his rifle now clearly visible as he aimed it directly at Jed's chest. I've seen enough of your handiwork to know exactly what kind of man you are, and I'll be damned if I help you drag Mrs. Barnes back to the hell you've created for her. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, with neither side willing to make the first move that would trigger a bloodbath in the sacred canyon. But Thomas chose that moment to cry out a stronger, healthier sound than he had made in days, proof that Chaska's healing herbs were working their ancient magic on his tiny body. The sound of his son's voice seemed to trigger something primal and possessive in Jed Barnes, overriding whatever tactical considerations might have counseled patience. That's my boy. He snarled, drawing his revolver with practiced speed. And I'll kill every one of you red devils and traitors before I let you corrupt him with your heathen ways. The battle erupted with sudden explosive violence that shattered the canyon's ancient tranquility. Jed's first shot went wide, chipping rock near Chaska's head as the Lakota warrior dove for cover behind a massive boulder. Billy's rifle cracked from above, and one of the hired guns spun and fell, clutching a shattered shoulder while screaming curses that echoed off the canyon walls. Clara pressed herself against the spring's rocky edge, shielding Thomas with her body, as bullets whined overhead and ricocheted off stone surfaces with deadly unpredictability. The confined space amplified every gunshot into thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, while gunsmoke began to fill the canyon with choking gray clouds that made breathing difficult and visibility poor. Chaska moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator, using his intimate knowledge of the canyon's layout to appear and disappear, like smoke firing carefully aimed shots that forced Jed's men to seek cover while conserving his limited ammunition for maximum effect. His military rifle gave him range and accuracy advantages over the handguns most of the hired killers carried, but he was still badly outnumbered and outgunned. Billy provided crucial support from his elevated position, picking off targets of opportunity, while keeping the attackers focused on multiple threats instead of concentrating their fire on any single defender. His knowledge of the canyon's acoustics allowed him to use ricochet shots to deadly effect, bouncing bullets off rock surfaces to strike enemies who thought themselves safely concealed. But despite their tactical advantages, Clara could see that the defenders were slowly being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Chaska had taken a bullet in his left arm, blood soaking through his shirt as he continued to fight with grim determination. Billy was running low on ammunition, his shots becoming more infrequent as he conserved rounds for the most critical moments. Jed himself seemed to bear a charmed life, moving through the battle with reckless aggression that suggested either supreme confidence or complete madness. He advanced steadily toward Clara's position, using his men as shields while maintaining constant pressure on the defenders. His face was twisted with rage and anticipation, on the mask of civilization completely stripped away to reveal the savage beneath. "It's over, Clara," he shouted above the gunfire, his voice hoarse with excitement and bloodlust. "Your red-skin lover is dying. Your boy traitor is out of bullets, and you're all alone with nowhere to run. Time to come home and face the consequences of your disobedience." As if to emphasize his words, another of his bullets struck dangerously close to where Clara crouched, sending rock fragments flying that cut her cheek and reminded her of how precarious their situation had become. Thomas was crying steadily now, terrified by the violence surrounding them, but still clinging to life. With the tenacity that had carried him through fever and across hostile wilderness, the sight of her son's fear and the growing certainty that they were all going to die in this canyon triggered something deep and primal in Clara's maternal instincts. She had endured years of abuse, had fled across hostile territory, had risked everything to protect Thomas from the monster she had married. She would not allow it to end here with Jed triumphant and her son delivered back into the hands of evil. While Jed reloaded his revolver, confident that victory was within his grasp, Clara made a desperate decision that would either save them all or ensure they died together. The spring beside which they sheltered was fed by underground streams that had carved extensive caverns in the surrounding rock, creating unstable formations that flash floods had been undermining for centuries. Above their position, a massive boulder balanced precariously on the canyon wall, held in place by centuries of erosion that had left it perched like a sword over the battleground below. If she could somehow trigger its fall, it might change the odds dramatically in their favor, or it might kill them all indiscriminately. The sound of approaching footsteps triggered another memory fragment. Jed's boots on the cabin floor, always heavier when he'd been drinking, always meaning pain was coming. But this time, instead of cowering, Clara felt something inside her crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. "Thomas," she whispered to her son, pressing her lips against his tiny ear. "Mama's going to make the bad man go away forever." Clara rose from her concealment with Thomas clutched against her chest, presenting herself as an apparently easy target to draw Jed's attention while she maneuvered toward the base of the unstable rock formation. Her movement caught his eye immediately, and his face lit up with triumphant anticipation as he raised his freshly loaded revolver. "That's right, darling," he called out mockingly, advancing toward her with predatory confidence. "No more hiding, no more running. time to face your husband like a proper obedient wife should." But as Jed closed the distance between them, his attention focused entirely on his wife and child. He failed to notice Clara's true objective, or the way she positioned herself carefully in relation to the precarious boulder above. Years of abuse had taught her to read his moods and anticipate his actions, and she used that hard-won knowledge now to predict exactly where he would be when she made her final desperate gambit. When Jed was directly beneath the balanced stone, Clara summoned every ounce of strength remaining in her battered body and kicked hard against a smaller rock that had been acting as a partial support for the massive formation above. The impact sent shock waves through the unstable pile, and for a heart-stopping moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with a grinding roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the canyon, the enormous boulder shifted and began its deadly descent. Jed looked up just in time to see his doom rushing toward him, his expression shifting from triumph to disbelief to terror in the space of a single heartbeat. He tried to dive aside, but the confined space and loose footing betrayed him. The massive stone struck him with the force of an avalanche, crushing him instantly and continuing its destructive path to block the canyon entrance completely. The sound of the impact was followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the gentle bubbling of the sacred spring and Thomas's weakening cries. The remaining hired guns, witnessing their employer's sudden and violent death, seemed to lose all stomach for the fight. Those who were still mobile began withdrawing toward what they thought was the canyon entrance, only to discover that their escape route was now blocked by tons of fallen rock that would take days to clear even with proper equipment. Billy Morrison emerged from his concealment among the rocks, his rifle still ready, but his expression showing a mixture of relief and shock at the sudden conclusion of the battle. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, staring at the massive pile of stone that marked Jed Barnes's final resting place. "I never saw anything like that in my life." Chaska struggled to his feet, blood loss from his wounded arm making him unsteady, but his eyes bright with something that might have been approval as he looked at Clara. "Spirits of this place have spoken," he said quietly, his voice carrying overtones of awe and respect. "Evil is buried deep in sacred ground, where it cannot poison the world of the living. You have done what needed to be done, brave woman." Clara collapsed beside the spring, her strength finally giving out now that immediate danger had passed. Thomas was nursing weakly, but steadily, his fever completely broken and his color returning to normal, healthy pink. The sight of her son recovering filled her with a joy so intense it almost overwhelmed the trauma and exhaustion of the past few days. "Is it really over?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe that the nightmare that had defined her existence for more than 2 years might finally be ending. "Is he really dead?" Billy knelt beside the pile of rubble that had once been Jed Barnes, confirming what they all already knew. "He's dead, Mrs. Barnes. Crushed flat as a pancake. Won't be hurting you or anyone else ever again." The surviving hired guns, faced with the reality of their situation, quickly indicated their desire to surrender rather than continue a fight that had lost all purpose with their employer's death. Billy disarmed them efficiently, his medical training allowing him to treat their wounds while ensuring they posed no further threat to the group. "We need to get you and the baby back to town," he said, examining Thomas with practiced hands. "My pa needs to look at both of you properly, make sure there's no lasting damage from everything you've been through." But Clara found herself reluctant to leave the sacred canyon that had become the site of their deliverance. The spring bubbled peacefully beside them, its clear water reflecting fragments of blue sky visible between the towering canyon walls. This place had witnessed the end of her torment and the beginning of something new. She wasn't sure yet what that something might be, but she could feel its presence like dawn light touching the eastern horizon. The journey back to Deadwood Creek required careful planning and considerable ingenuity. The canyon's main entrance was blocked by the rockfall that had claimed Jed's life, but Chaska knew of alternate routes through the maze of passages that connected this sacred site to the outside world. Despite his wounded arm, he led them through narrow crevices and hidden paths that would have been impossible to find without intimate knowledge of the terrain. Clara carried Thomas while Billy helped support Chaska, whose blood loss was becoming a serious concern despite his stoic refusal to acknowledge weakness or pain. The Lakota warrior moved with dogged determination, driven by some inner strength that seemed to transcend physical limitations. But Clara could see that he was nearing the end of his endurance. They emerged from the canyon system near sunset, the dying light painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful to be real after the violence and trauma of the past few hours. The contrast between the peaceful evening and the morning's deadly battle felt surreal, as if they had passed through some fundamental barrier between two different worlds. Billy had managed to capture several of the horses belonging to Jed's hired men, providing transportation for the group as they made their way toward town. Clara rode double with Thomas, while Billy helped keep Chaska in his saddle as weakness from blood loss began to take its toll on the wounded warrior. As they traveled, Clara found herself studying Chaska's profile. In the fading light, wondering about the man who had risked everything to help strangers of a different race and culture. His actions had saved both her life and Thomas's, but she knew virtually nothing about his background or circumstances beyond the few glimpses she had caught of his personal belongings. "Why did you help us?" she asked quietly as they rode through the gathering dusk. "You could have just ignored us, avoided getting involved in our troubles. Why risk your life for people you'd never met before?" Chaska was silent for so long that Clara began to think he might not answer, or that perhaps blood loss had affected his consciousness more than he was willing to admit. But finally, he spoke in a voice so soft she had to strain to hear his words above the sound of hoofbeats and creaking leather. "I had wife once." He said simply, his words carrying depths of pain that no amount of time seemed able to heal. Beautiful woman named Winona, gentle as spring rain and brave as winter wind. We had son together, little boy called Dakota, who laughed like flowing water and brought joy to everyone who knew him. He paused, gathering strength for words that clearly cost him tremendous effort to speak aloud. "White soldiers came to our village 3 winters ago, looking for warriors who had raided supply wagons. We had done nothing wrong, but they said all Indians looked the same to them, that someone had to pay for what had been stolen." Clara felt her heart clench as she began to understand the source of the deep wounds she had sensed in Chaska from their first meeting. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, as if the events he described had happened yesterday rather than years ago. "They killed Dakota first." Chaska continued, his voice becoming almost mechanical as he forced himself through the narrative. "Shot him down like a dog when he tried to run to his mother. Then they killed Winona when she screamed and tried to protect his body. I was away hunting, came back to find them both dead in our lodge blood, everywhere. Everything we had built together destroyed in moments." The story explained so much about the man who had become their unlikely savior. His solitary existence, his immediate response to Thomas's illness, his willingness to risk everything for strangers. He was trying to balance the scales to save a child, in hope of somehow atoning for his failure to protect his own son. "I'm sorry." Clara whispered the words, completely inadequate, but the only ones she could find. "I'm so very sorry for your loss. But what you did for us, the way you saved Thomas Dakota, would be proud of his father's courage and compassion." Chaska turned to look at her directly for the first time since beginning his story, and Clara was shocked to see tears glistening on his weathered cheeks. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe Dakota and Winona guided me to Sacred Spring at right time to help another mother and child. Maybe spirits work in ways we cannot understand to bring healing from tragedy." They reached Deadwood Creek near midnight, their arrival causing considerable commotion as Billy roused his father and other prominent citizens to deal with the aftermath of Jed Barnes's death and the revelations about his criminal activities. Dr. Morrison took immediate charge of medical care for both Chaska and Thomas, his experienced hands working to clean and dress the warrior's gunshot wound, while examining the baby for any lingering effects of his fever. "The child is going to be fine," the elderly physician pronounced after a thorough examination. "Whatever herbs your friend used, they worked remarkably well. The fever has broken completely, and his breathing is clear and strong. With proper rest and nutrition, he should make a full recovery." Chaska's condition was more serious, the bullet having passed clean through his arm, but causing significant damage to muscle and blood vessels. Dr. Morrison worked through the night to repair what he could, his skilled hands guided by decades of frontier medical experience that had taught him to work miracles with limited resources. "He's lost a lot of blood," the doctor explained to Clara as he finished stitching the wound. "But he's strong, and the bullet missed the major arteries. With rest and proper care, he should heal completely, though it will take time." While the medical care continued, Billy organized a search of Jed's property that revealed the full extent of his criminal activities over the years. Hidden in a secret compartment beneath the cabin floor, investigators found not only evidence of systematic embezzlement and tax fraud, but also personal belongings from the missing women Sarah Whitman's jewelry, Mary Hoskins's distinctive hair combs, and items from several other victims whose disappearances had never been properly investigated. The discoveries vindicated every whispered suspicion and unspoken fear that had circulated through the territory for years. Jed Barnes had been a serial killer, as well as an embezzler using his position of authority and respect to prey upon vulnerable women while maintaining his facade as a pillar of the community. When territorial authorities arrived to investigate the situation, Clara found herself treated not as a fugitive, but as a hero who had rid the territory of a dangerous criminal. The evidence of Jed's crimes was overwhelming, and her account of years of abuse was corroborated by Dr. Morrison's medical records and testimony from other citizens who had witnessed signs of her mistreatment. "Mrs. Barnes," the territorial marshal said formally, "I want you to know that no charges will be filed against you or your associates in connection with your husband's death. Based on the evidence we've uncovered, it's clear that you acted in self-defense against a man who posed an immediate threat to you and your child." The legal proceedings that followed were surprisingly swift and decisive. Jed's will, which had left everything to Clara, was probated without challenge. His extensive property holdings, including the cattle ranch he had managed for the Kendrick family, were transferred to her ownership, along with bank accounts that had been swollen by years of criminal activity. Suddenly, Clara found herself not only free from her abusive marriage, but also financially secure in a way she had never imagined possible. The irony was not lost on her that the man who had made her life a living hell for more than 2 years had also, through his death, provided her with the means to build a new and better life for herself and Thomas. But despite her newfound wealth and freedom, Clara discovered that she had little desire to remain in Deadwood Creek, with its painful memories and curious stares from neighbors who had known about her suffering but done nothing to help. The town that had been her prison for so long could never become her home in any meaningful sense. As Chaska recovered from his wounds under Dr. Morrison's care, Clara found herself spending increasing amounts of time at his bedside, drawn by gratitude that gradually deepened into something more complex and profound. Their conversations, conducted in a mixture of English and the few Lakota words she was beginning to learn, revealed layers of intelligence, wisdom, and gentle humor that had been hidden beneath his warrior exterior. "What will you do now?" she asked one afternoon as he sat propped up in bed, his wounded arm immobilized in a sling, but his color gradually returning to normal. "When you're well enough to travel, I mean. Will you return to your people?" Chaska's expression grew thoughtful as he considered her question. "My people scattered after the raid that killed my family," he said slowly. "Some went north to Canada, some west to mountains, some east to reservations, where the government promises to care for them in exchange for their freedom. I do not know where they are now, or if they would welcome back a man who failed to protect his own blood. The pain in his voice was still raw despite the passage of years, and Clara found herself reaching out to touch his uninjured hand in a gesture of comfort that felt entirely natural, despite the cultural barriers between them. "You didn't fail anyone," she said firmly. "You were away hunting, providing for your family the way a good man should. What happened to them wasn't your fault. In my heart, I know this is true." Chaska replied, his fingers closing gently around hers. But knowledge of the mind and healing of the spirit are different things. Sometimes the heart cannot believe what the mind knows to be right. Clara understood that sentiment more completely than he might have realized. Despite all the evidence of Jed's crimes and all the testimony to his abusive nature, part of her still felt responsible for the violence that had consumed their marriage. Victims of abuse often internalized blame that rightfully belonged to their tormentors, and healing from such psychological wounds took far longer than recovery from physical injuries. "Maybe," she said, carefully testing the words even as she spoke them, "maybe we could help each other heal. You saved my life and Thomas's life, but you also saved our souls. That has to count for something in the spirit world, doesn't it?" Chaska studied her face intently, seeming to weigh not just her words, but the deeper meanings behind them. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder, as if he was considering possibilities that had never occurred to him before. White woman and Lakota man walking same path together, he mused. Such things happen sometimes, but rarely and never without great difficulty. Your people and mine, we have much blood between us, much hatred and mistrust. Path would not be easy for any of us. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy. Clara replied, thinking of the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I've learned that running away from difficulties doesn't solve them. It just moves them to a different place. But facing them with someone you trust, someone who understands your pain, that might make the difference between surviving and truly living." Thomas chose that moment to wake from his nap, his healthy cries filling the room with sound that spoke of life and hope and futures yet to be written. Clara lifted him from his makeshift cradle, marveling again at the miracle of his recovery and the second chance they had all been given. "What do you think, little one?" she asked her son, though she knew he was too young to understand the question. "Should we find out what lies beyond the horizon, or should we play it safe and stick to the familiar paths?" Thomas gurgled and reached toward Chaska, with the fearless curiosity of infancy, tiny fingers grasping for the beaded decorations on the warrior's shirt. Chaska smiled, the first genuine smile Clara had seen from him, and gently offered his finger for the baby to grasp his scarred face, transforming into something approaching beauty when touched by joy. "Little warrior has courage." Chaska observed his voice warm with affection. "He reaches for what he wants, without fear, trusts his heart to guide his hands. Maybe we should learn from him, yes. Maybe courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of fear. The decision, when it finally came, felt as natural and inevitable, a sunrise after the darkest night. Clara would liquidate her holdings in Deadwood Creek and use the proceeds to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere without the weight of painful memories pressing down on every street corner and familiar building. But she would not travel alone. Chaska had received word through the mysterious networks that connected scattered native communities that remnants of his band had established a new settlement in the Black Hills, far from the reservations and military posts that represented confinement and cultural death. They were living in the old way, as much as possible hunting and gathering, while avoiding conflict with white authorities through careful isolation and traditional wisdom. "They might accept you," he explained to Clara as they made their final preparations for departure. "Not as white woman trying to play at being Indian, but as woman who has proven courage and wisdom who has been accepted by the spirits of sacred places. But it will not be easy life. No stores, no doctors, when sickness comes no law except what we make ourselves. Clara looked around the comfortable room in Dr. Morrison's house, where they had been staying with its familiar furnishings and civilized conveniences that represented everything she had once thought she wanted from life. Then she looked at Thomas, nursing contentedly in her arms, and at Chaska, his strength returning daily as his body healed from wounds suffered protecting them both. "I've had stores and doctors and law," she said quietly. "They didn't protect me from years of abuse, didn't save Thomas when he was dying, didn't stop Jed from murdering innocent women. Sometimes the things we think will keep us safe are just pretty chains that bind us to lives we never chose." Billy Morrison had volunteered to handle the legal aspects of dissolving her territorial holdings, his newfound authority, as deputy marshal lending weight to transactions that might otherwise have faced bureaucratic obstacles. The young man had been transformed by his experiences in the canyon, aged beyond his years by witnessing both the depths of human evil and the heights of human courage. "I'll make sure everything is handled properly," he promised as he reviewed the paperwork that would transfer Clara's property to new owners. "And I'll keep an ear open for news about your husband's other victims. Maybe now that the truth is known, their families can finally have some peace." Dr. Morrison proved more difficult to convince, his professional training and paternal instincts rebelling against the idea of Clara taking an infant into the wilderness without access to medical care. But when he saw the way she looked at Chaska and the way the wounded warrior's eyes lit up whenever Thomas was near, he began to understand then that healing came in many forms, not all of them found in medical textbooks. "You're sure about this?" he asked Clara during one of their final conversations. "Once you disappear into those hills, there's no guarantee we'll ever see you again. If something goes wrong, if the baby gets sick or you need help, then we'll face it together." Clara replied, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised even her. "I've learned that the things we can't control are less important than how we respond to them. Thomas and I have already survived the worst things that could happen to us. Everything else is just another challenge to overcome." The old doctor studied her face for a long moment, seeing strength and determination that hadn't been there when she first arrived in Deadwood Creek as a frightened mail-order bride. "You've changed," he observed finally. "That scared little girl who married Jed Barnes is gone, replaced by someone I barely recognize." "She had to die," Clara said simply. "She was too weak to protect her son, too afraid to fight for what was right. The woman I am now, she's been forged in fire and stone, tested in ways that either destroy you or make you stronger. I chose to become stronger." They left Deadwood Creek on a crisp morning in early October, when autumn was painting the hills in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise new beginnings. Clara rode her own horse, now having learned the basics of frontier horsemanship, during their weeks of preparation, while Thomas traveled in a traditional cradleboard that Chaska had crafted with his own hands during his recovery. The cradleboard was a work of art as much as utility, decorated with intricate beadwork and protective symbols that represented Chaska's hopes and prayers for the child's future safety and happiness. Watching him work on the project during long evenings by lamplight, Clara had begun to understand the deep spiritual significance that Native peoples attached to everyday objects, the way practical necessity could be elevated into sacred art through love and intention. Their pack horse carried supplies carefully chosen for a life lived close to the land, tools for hunting and building, medicines, both traditional and modern, books for Thomas's education, and seeds for crops that could be grown in hidden valleys far from curious eyes. Everything they took had been selected for durability and utility, the accumulated wisdom of frontier survival, distilled into portable form.